I am recording this session and hope to share copies, a link with everyone when we're done. Okay. All right. Some more people joining. Okay, well, it's 7 o'clock. I'll keep an eye on folks waiting room and let them in as they arrive. But in the meantime, I'll hand it over to Esther. Esther Enkin is the Vice President of the Canadian Journalism Forum on Violence and Trauma and a former CBC News Ombudsman. So Esther, I'll throw it over to you to get us started.
Thanks, Rhonda, and welcome everyone. And of course, thank you for joining us. And I know you'll come away thinking it was well worth your time to be here. We hope that after this session, you'll have some knowledge and skills to plan for covering difficult stories. And I don't have to tell you the toll hearing and watching trauma can have. Tonight, we'll review how best to plan for coverage of traumatic events. We will also help you to understand the nature of that trauma, its impact on you, and ways to mitigate that impact. The timing, of course, is no coincidence as you embark on the coverage of the Mass Casualty Commission. And just as the people involved risk being re-traumatized, so do you. In order to plan effectively for covering stories like this one, it's important to also understand stress and trauma and the impact on each one of us. In understanding it, you can take steps to mitigate it, to take good care of yourself for the sake of your own mental well-being, and as a happy side effect, continue to do your jobs effectively. And we're lucky enough to have a leading international expert in this field. Anthony Feinstein is a professor of psychiatry at University of Toronto, and he's done extensive research on journalists in conflict situations. He's published a series of seminal studies exploring the psychological effects of conflict on journalists in the Balkans, Iran, Afghanistan, Mexico, amongst other places. He currently consults to a number of news organizations, including the Globe, CNN, and the New York Times. His documentary, Under Fire, which I recommend, based on his work, won a Peabody Award in 2012. And if that isn't impressive enough, Dr. Feinstein has a whole other research life involving groundbreaking work involving patients with multiple sclerosis. And we're also delighted to welcome Dave Seglins, a senior investigative journalist with CBC News based in Toronto, who has become a well-being champion in his own newsroom and an advocate in the industry. He's the co-lead of a national study of more than 1,200 journalists called Taking Care, a survey on mental health, well-being, and trauma in Canadian journalism, due to report this spring. He's an educator and consultant who holds certificates in global mental health and trauma from Harvard Medical School and mental health first aid from the Mental Health Commission of Canada. Dave has developed and leads courses at CBC on supporting well-being while covering difficult stories. So here's what you can expect for 90 minutes or so. Unfortunately, Dr. Feinstein has to leave us in about an hour, but Dave and I will continue to carry on. And the important thing to know is you don't have to be in a war zone to experience serious stress in our line of work, as I'm sure you're well aware. So Dave's going to start out with a quick overview of those stresses. And Anthony then will explain the science of what is happening to us when we feel that stress, address some of the myths around PTSD, and provide coping strategies, how best to look after yourself. Dave will then lead a discussion on planning for difficult stories, and we can focus it very much on what's upcoming, before, during, and after. And we hope you'll be able to take this information back to your newsrooms, incorporate these tactics and approaches in your own editorial planning. So Dave, over to you. And if you have any comments or questions ongoing, please use the chat. Later on, we'll have a more interactive Q&A session, and I'll get back to you then on the mechanics of that. So Dave, over to you.
Thanks, Esther. Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming. Thank you for carving out time to talk about this, think about it, because talking about it and planning ahead of time is probably one of the best things you can do. I have not worked in war zones. I had my run-in with PTSD sitting in a courtroom, watching vivid images, not getting a lot of sleep, and it was the pileup of things that really led me to even want to understand this better. And that's how I got into teaching and exploring this. I'm going to do a quick share here. Can everybody see my image of the stressed out office worker / journalist? Can we see that?
We can see it.
Excellent. So, you know, in our work, I think we all understand it's a frontline industry, right? While the rest of the world is running away from the dangers, we're running towards them. But we also do it under a ridiculous amount of stress. And I don't think we've actually reckoned as an industry what those stressors are, but let's name them for a moment. Deadlines, the number of deadlines, the workload, the fact that we're filing to multiple platforms, often for different times of day. We're also tapping out on Twitter, social media. We're also facing a barrage of distrust and anger and hate and backlash over social media. We have technical challenges, especially during COVID. Our work has suddenly become part of our homes for those of us who aren't working in the shop. We have a sense of isolation like never before. We don't have the friends hanging out or the colleagues hanging out in the workspace. We don't have that built-in support at times of COVID. Of course, graphic scenes, graphic imagery, reporting on suffering and death. These are all stresses. And now you're heading into this period of covering the Mass Casualty Commission. The really good news is we're actually resilient. Humans are wired to be resilient. So there's good news in this. And as journalists, we have certain protections. We have our professional mission. So we know we've got a job to do. We can actually do a lot of good here, especially covering this commission of inquiry that's going to look for answers to make sure something like this never happens in the way it did again. We have our colleagues. We have our employers' support, we hope. We are governed by an ethical code, and we're doing public good. We are part of the process of the healing that is going to be this commission of inquiry. So those are things that already we protect us. We also get paid, never enough, but that's a thing, right? We're paid to be here. We've got a job to do. So those are things that help support us. So that's good, but we also have to recognize that we have a capacity issue. We can only handle so much stress. So I'm going to show you what I call my pickle jar. It's a simple visual thing that has helped me sort of think about, okay, we got stresses piling up, deadlines. Oh, somebody else called for another version. Oh my God, the guy's honking at me, driving past, calling me fake news. And now I've got to do this story on this horrible set of facts. So these stresses pile up. And unless we strategize and figure out, okay, how are we going to offload some of our stress? How are we going to manage it, deal with it, so that we don't get over capacity? Because we know we've got the workload, the deadlines, the traumatic stories, harassment. We could have conflict at work. Some of us may experience racism or exclusion of other kinds. We're working around the clock. We've got lack of sleep. We've got job insecurity. We may have our own personal health issues pre-existing. We've got to manage all that, right? And so there are some basic strategies. We're going to talk about all of this. Rest is number one. Food, getting some physical activity, getting a break so that we can actually unplug. I got some other ones here. Hobbies, friends, taking care of yourself, going to the movies, watching a movie, music. So those are going to be some of the strategies we'll talk about because we want to be able to manage the load. Because when we can't and we get to that near overflowing point, you need to acknowledge it in yourself. You need to acknowledge it in others. And if you're an assignment editor or a manager, you need to be able to understand it and know what to do for members of your team. Because that breaking point is the point where you're going to need some professional help. Whether you've got a counselor available to you, a doctor, if you're lucky enough to have an EAP, you need time off. You've got to stop work. Or that's where we get. I just offer that as a mental model to think about, because you cannot be expected to work with all of the stressors of the industry and carry a huge load without it having an impact on you. So you've got to come up with strategies to maintain your work so that you can do excellent work. Anyway, I just wanted to start with that to sort of ground the conversation in the very real stressors that we all know we have, but we need to name, and we got to figure out a strategy to deal with them. At which point I'm going to hand it over to Anthony. Anthony?
Thanks, Dave, and thank you for the invitation to be here and to talk to you on this important topic. I would like to cover three things. One is to speak a little bit about post-traumatic stress disorder. Dave has alluded to it already. I'd like to correct some misconceptions about the condition. I would like to speak a little bit about stress, and then also about what you can do to manage these particular problems. So let me start with the definition of PTSD. You know, a lot's been written about it. It's almost as though this term has worked its way into our vernacular. It's bandied about, I think, quite loosely at times, and people might not understand exactly what the condition is, what the symptoms are, and the full implications for this particular disorder. So post-traumatic stress disorder is defined as a mental illness that can arise in response to an overwhelming stressor. So, you know, you generally confront an event that is outside the ordinary. This is the kind of event in which your life was threatened, or other people's lives were threatened, or in fact, you see other people getting killed or dead people. So a very high bar for what the stressor is. And then in response to that, symptoms fall into four broad groups. The first refers to the re-experiencing the phenomenon. You have unwanted, uncalled for intrusive recollections of a traumatic event, maybe through flashbacks, nightmares, memories that just intrude into your consciousness. The second symptom grouping refers to avoidance, that these are such unpleasant experiences, you don't want to re-experience them. You make a conscious effort to try and avoid them, to blot them out, to stay away from them. For journalists, this can present a problem, because if you've been exposed to a traumatic event, and this is news, and your news organization is asking you to revisit it and to go back to the scene and report on it, but you've got PTSD, the avoidance that you experience clashes with the demands of your job. So avoidance is the second symptom grouping. The third refers to part of your nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, that becomes hyper-aroused. So you have difficulty falling asleep, or you can't concentrate, or you're irritable. You have a prominent startle response, or you come back to a safe environment, but you still feel under threat. You're hypervigilant, you're looking over your shoulder. And the fourth symptom grouping refers to like a depressive quality that enters your thoughts. The things that in the past you might have looked forward to, you no longer look forward to them. You anticipate a sense of misfortune. You anticipate something bad happening again. It takes away your sense of enjoyment or the bloom to life. And the important point about post-traumatic stress disorder is that you have to have symptoms from all four groups: the re-experiencing, the avoidance, the hyper-arousal of your nervous system, plus this negative connotation to your thoughts. And the final point that the American Psychiatric Association makes is that these symptoms have to be present for at least 28 days. Now that's a pretty arbitrary cutoff point, but what the APA is saying is that symptoms that I've described to you can be quite common following a traumatic event, but in many people, they just tend to fade away as the days run into weeks. It's when those symptoms endure and they're there for 28 days or longer, and they come in all four symptom clusters, that you have the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. This can affect anywhere between 5 to 8% of the Canadian population over the course of their lifetime, so it's certainly not uncommon. And there's good data to show that the rates are higher in journalists than they are within the general population. The good news behind all of this is that PTSD is treatable. There are effective psychological therapies like cognitive behavior therapy, prolonged exposure therapy, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing that can really make a difference with respect to PTSD. My second big point is that PTSD is a stress. It stresses the body. Dave has spoken about many other different kinds of stress that you experience in your line of work. A little bit of stress is good for us. It motivates us. It gets us up out of our chair. But when stress becomes excessive, it can become paralyzing. And stress affects the body physiologically. It leads to a surge in hormone cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone, and cortisol over the long term can have negative effects on brain structure and brain function. You know, Esther kindly mentioned my work in multiple sclerosis. A very dramatic finding in the MS literature is that when people with multiple sclerosis who have a compromised immune system are put in a stressful situation, the nature of what you see on a brain MRI changes. They develop more lesions. You show the breakdown of the blood-brain barrier in response to high cortisol and stress. But the good news with that is that when you bring in stress reduction therapies, you see a reversal of that. You see less lesions. You see the blood-brain barrier reconstituting. There is now abundant evidence that good psychotherapy affects the immune system in a positive way. It boosts positive immune markers and reduces negative ones. And so there is a very strong link between stress on the one hand, hormones like cortisol, brain changes on the other, but the benefits of good stress reduction therapy in terms of brain health. The final point that I want to make is one that Dave alluded to, is that when you confront multiple negative events, if you find yourself fixated on it and you ruminate on it, you get yourself into a lot of trouble. You need to recognize that there are many events in your work that you cannot control. You can't control the flow of news. You can't control what bad citizens do. You can't control a mass shooting. You can't control the pandemic and the lockdowns. And it's very important for you to be able to recognize that and not to spend too much emotional energy focusing on those things that you cannot control, because we all have a limited amount of resilience, a limited amount of, as I put it, capital in the bank that allows us to withstand stress. You don't want to use it up, particularly when we're doing this in the long haul, in which you have to do this kind of work year after year after year. Instead, focus on those things in your life that you can control: your sleep, what you eat, your leisure pursuits, nourishing relationships. Remember all the effort that you put into your work. You're so creative, you're so hardworking. Well, you need to put some of that energy into relationships, because good relationships are protective in terms of your mental health. They are the buffer to our mental well-being. So don't put all your energies into your work, but devote time for other things and devote time to relationships because they're healthy. I think one of the mantras that's been so powerful during the pandemic is this: respite as a form of resilience. Have your moments of respite. Build it in, your downtime, seeing friends, socializing, going for a cup of coffee. Even within a very busy day, structure a little bit of time away from your console, away from the computer. Go for a walk, go and do something different. Leave a message on your screen. I'm taking a break for half an hour. I will not be responding to messages. And go away and do something different. Have your moment of respite. The world will go on without you. The world will function without you. You can take these mini breaks to look after your emotional health, because remember, your capacity is finite. You need to look after yourself. Good journalism depends on healthy journalists. So there are ways for you to manage your stress. And they may sound very small things, but when taken cumulatively, and when they practice over time, they build up. And they create a compelling argument as to why this is going to help you. So with those few thoughts, I'd like to pass it back to you, Dave, and maybe I can pick up some of these threads later in the discussion.
Super. Thank you, Anthony. I'm getting a little bit of feedback. There we go. So I would love to ask a question. If you could just use the chat function maybe to give me an answer. But on a regular day in your news work, who eats lunch? What is, of every day, 80% of the time, I'm thinking more in the office, in the tradition when we weren't working remotely. I'm still working remotely, but how many people here take time to eat lunch? Just throw it in the chat. What is lunch? I love that, right? Anybody else? Anybody want to share whether you have lunch? Where do I eat it? Yeah, that's a great question. So why am I asking this question? I stress eat while I work, all right. If I skip it, I can't work, good. Yes, but at my desk, yes. Does lunch count if you have it at supper? Sort of, not really. I'm at a desk all day, I eat lunch at my desk. Okay, so why am I asking? I'm asking because we are so good in our business at prioritizing the story, right? We're not very good at prioritizing our well-being around it. And I don't know how we change the culture of this industry, but I do have some exercises that can get us there. There are some best practices, and especially when we're in a situation we're thinking about the Mass Casualty Commission, how are we going to approach this? The fact that we're having this discussion now is great news because we're a week or so out. We can plan. I'm going to share a checklist with you, and don't worry about taking notes right now because I'm actually going to share a link. You can have access to this. I'm going to encourage, let me just see if I can share this right now. Let me go here. Can everybody see my fancy checklist? It's not there yet, but the white sheet. So this is an exercise which I would encourage, and this is less for frontline staff and reporters. This is more for people who are on the assignment desk, but it's actually for the whole team. But the onus is not just on the frontline people to make sure that they eat their lunch. It's actually to make sure that the people who are planning the work make time for their people to have lunch. Heading into a difficult story, we can do a couple of things. Usually it's breaking news and we don't have much time to think about anything, but these principles are all helpful to think about. Here we do have some planning time. We can think about the before, during, and after of a difficult story. I say it's a difficult story because it's a big story, it's graphic, it's highly emotional, what you're about to go into. So here are some of the things that we can do before, and I'm going to send you a link that gives you a more detailed checklist. But first off, has your newsroom or have you as a journalist ever done any training around mental health or well-being? I think the answer for most of us is likely no. This is something that newsrooms need to think about. And we're not going to solve that problem before you cover this commission of inquiry. But the reality is, until we start talking about well-being and protecting people's well-being in the way we do our work, we're going to continue to have problems with stress, overload, and unfortunately, some of us are going to suffer things like PTSD and other mental health conditions that result from being overworked, everything from anxiety to depression to burnout. So we can do risk assessments. So if we're heading in to cover the truckers' protest, or if we are running in to cover the BC floods or the forest fires or a mass murder case or what have you, we can do a risk assessment. We can sit down as a team and we can say, okay, we know if it were a physical threat, do we have suntan lotion, right? Do we have flak jackets? Do we have security detail if we need it? Well, what about for our mental well-being? Are we talking about the potential risks of the emotional and psychological elements and things that we may be exposed to? Because we can sit down and we talk about them as a team beforehand, name it, and say, okay, so how are we going to deal with that? Well, here are some strategies to deal with exposure to horrible things, making sure that people get breaks, making sure that we do check-ins with each other. There's a whole series of things that we can do, but having a discussion, whether it's a formal risk assessment or not, beforehand, so the team can actually voice, I'm concerned about this, is a good opportunity to put things on the table so that you can plan for how you're going to deal with it. Your assignment desk, check in with your people. Heading into coverage of this commission of inquiry, how are people feeling about it? Are you up to it? Because if you're not, I'd suggest your team should be making another plan or finding some backup or finding some ways to support people. Because if you go in not feeling like you're up to it, you're at risk. Prepare a coverage plan. All right, think about what does a day look like? What does a typical day look like? How many stories do you have? How many reporting, camera resources do you have? What is the expectation on your people? And is your plan sustainable? What's the workload? How many hours a day do you think people are going to be going? How many stories each day? Which platforms? Are you building in any downtime? These are all questions that you should be asking yourself to see whether the expectation for the frontline people to the assignment desk, because we want to do excellent journalism on this, right? We want to cover this well, and we don't want to be hurting ourselves. And you need to talk about this question. Newsroom have a protocol if someone needs a break, if somebody wants to put up their hand and say, you know what, I can't do this today. Are they allowed to? I know in my work in this field, asking this question in a room full of journalists, depending on the news organization, in fact, I will tell you that at CBC, I get different answers. Some newsrooms have an open discussion about well-being and wellness in some centers, and they have a policy. Look, if you can't do it, just come to us. Tell us you need a day, 2 days, whatever you need. We'll figure it out. Your well-being's most important. No repercussions, because this is what reporters and frontline people are worried about. I don't want to have retaliation. I don't want to be thought of as weak. I don't want to be pulled off the story. If I just need a day, but I don't want people thinking, oh my gosh, I'm not up to it for the next 3 months.
Dave, just
Yes.
sorry, I do have something moving. I'm getting a lot of interference. So it might
my
be a piece of
apologies.
paper on a speaker.
It is a piece of paper
microphone?
on a speaker. Sorry.
Yeah, okay.
So just have a discussion with your team and think about what your protocol is. Is your newsroom safe for you to be able to go to your supervisor, your assignment people, to say, you know what, I need a break here. And it doesn't have to be the end of you covering things. But newsrooms need to think through that. I can tell you, me personally, as recently as a year or two ago, when I was being overwhelmed by stories about death and COVID death and other deaths, and then I was assigned to deal with another story about another death, and I put up my hand and I said, you know what, I'm sorry, I can't do this. I was told that's not the way it works. You can't refuse an assignment. And it has given me great pause in my career. And I'm going to push back and say, actually, that's exactly the way it works. If we as journalists feel like we are being harmed by the work that we're doing, we need to be able to put up our hands. I managed to work it out with my manager, but that is not a comfortable discussion to have. And I would encourage your team to think through so that you've got a good model so that people aren't afraid to say when they need a break. Self-care, this is something you can do beforehand. Think about it, make a plan. How are you going to unplug during the course of this coverage? How are you going to build in breaks? How are you going to build in time for lunch, especially at an inquiry like this, when the lunchtime means the testimony stops, which is perfect time for you to write and file and do all the work you need to do. And by the time you bang out your story, then the testimony resumes and now you're back into it and you haven't made time for yourself. How's that going to work? I don't have a solution for you, but you need to think about it. Then there's the during. Are you having regular check-ins with your colleagues, your desk? Is assignment checking in on your people about the stories? How are they coming? But just, are you okay? What do you need? Have discussions between each other. You need to be monitoring your own workload and that of your colleagues. As best you can, assignment folks, try to coordinate and streamline your demands. I think a best practice would be to have one sort of point of contact so that if you're a reporter in a busy newsroom, they're not being phoned by 3 or 4 or 5 different people. Does your newsroom have a reporting backup plan? So in the event that somebody burns out or needs a day, it's not an issue of like, oh, no, I can't do it because we have no other options. Nobody else can fill in. Well, it's actually important to know that if in a pinch, you know what your backup is and build in some downtime. Also, I think it's incumbent upon newsroom leaders to promote professional resources where they're available and if they're needed. And make sure that, you know, if you've got counseling services through your health benefits, or if that you don't, that you are earmarking where are the community supports, EAP, going to the doctor. And then after our coverage, and by this, you can think of this as being, you know, at the end of a day or at the end of a week, or even at the end of the entire coverage. Take time where assignment people should be checking in with their frontline staff and not just through email. We need to allow breaks and downtime. Maybe shaking up somebody's assignment so that they're not dealing with heavy material, giving them a down day, which isn't necessarily a day off, but time to collect your thoughts, to prepare for future stories. And again, referring where necessary to professional assistance. And then following up 3 weeks later. And I say 3 weeks later because, as Anthony alluded, there is, in the PTSD literature, there is a great deal of evidence that PTSD is this prolonged emotional, psychological response to stress. And so in our resilience, we can go through covering terrible things. We can be stressed out. We can have stress reactions. But if after 3 weeks, someone is still struggling, that's a real sign of trouble. And it's a reminder to each of us that we probably need professional help at that time. And once again, encouraging peer support, chances for teams to decompress. I want to get to the conversation because I actually think that questions between us and talking about some of these things will be the most helpful. But I can anticipate, as I've tried to put my brain to, okay, what are the main challenges of covering this commission of inquiry? I think everyone understands that graphic content, and that'll be in the form of images, recordings, the testimony. It's going to be tough. So steel yourself, know that, and acknowledge among your colleagues and your staff that those days are going to need a little extra care. The long hours are going to be a challenge. I also think the volume and complexity of the material. There are going to be days where transcripts of 911 calls are going to be dumped. There are going to be large legal briefs. There are going to be submissions from various parties to the inquiry. There's going to be a ton of reading. Think about that because it's going to be a real load. You're going to be doing stories that really touch on the victims' families, friends, the survivors in this massacre. You're going to be thinking about them. You're going to feel an obligation to get the story right. There's going to be intense public interest, so your work is going to be under incredible scrutiny. Don't underestimate that. That is a stress we carry with us. Social media is going to amplify the speed at which stories get pumped out and the reaction to your stories and others. And it's also the space where we get the harassment and the ugliness. So I have a few strategies to throw out. And first off, remember, you're doing important work. This is an opportunity not just to, like, we're talking about all the negatives here because we want to have our eyes wide open. But know that you're doing really important work. You are, like, think of this commission of inquiry, not just about finding answers, but it is about healing an entire province. And you, as the eyes and ears of the public, communicating the big lessons and stories out, you're playing a vital role in that healing. Make sure you get rest and sleep. Make sure you unplug. Get some physical exercise. And it's easy to list this. We all know this, but you've got to do it. You've got to put it in your calendar. You got to make it happen for yourself. Also know you're hopefully on a team, or if you're working independently or as a freelancer, as I know some of you are, reach out and build a team. You will have a community of journalists who are equally engaged in covering this inquiry. Make time for each other. Just have some discussions, have that peer support so you can blow off a little steam by saying, you know, wasn't that a horrible day? Having that support around you is really vital. Fridays. I understand that there are down days at the inquiry where there will be briefings, but there won't be testimony. I'm going to advocate for newsrooms and journalists to take those Fridays as development days. Number one, to process the week that was before, to get your thoughts, to read in, to catch up, to do some laundry, to, you know, like I would encourage newsrooms and journalists not to jump onto another story on Friday if the load is as we suspect it will be at this commission of inquiry. And again, setting up boundaries between your work and your life. In COVID, that's really hard. Have a separate room in your house that you can close the door if you're working from home. I would encourage people to go work at an office so you can leave it. And especially if you've got other members of your family around you, try to build a physical barrier so that there are times when you're on and times you're off and times you can just close the door. And lastly, family, friends, community. Find spaces where you don't have to talk about the subject matter, where you can put your brain and your heart and your activities into something else. That's a whole big download. And I did promise that I was going to share. Oh, how am I going to do that now? I've got to find the link. I'm going to put the link in the chat momentarily. Anyway, that's all for me for now. And I would love to open it up to questions, Esther, and see where we can get with that. Give me a moment. I will find the link in due course here.
Out after if you have a problem, but if we put it in the chat, people can copy it. So here's what we'd like to do, folks. I know everybody had their video off, and that's great for the quality. It doesn't degrade the quality of the presentation. So two things: we can use the chat for any questions you have or comments, and we have Anthony here for another 25 minutes. That was a very dense presentation done quickly and efficiently. It would be great to get your thoughts, your questions, suggestions, your own best practices. Love to see you and have it as a dialogue as much as one can with these little boxes. So if you want to use the raise hand function, I'm sure you're all aware, if you go to the reactions tab, usually it's at the far right corner of your screen, and you click on reactions and there's raise hand. I will look for those raised hands and acknowledge you and ask you to unmute yourself. If that seems a bit too much, this is all off the record, folks. This is your chance to really brainstorm together. Of course, anything you want to put in the chat, I'll be watching for and helping Anthony and Dave answer. And if there are similar comments, I will try to kind of consolidate them. So feel free, start typing, raise your hand. And what else do you want to know? What has worked for you or for your newsroom or for a colleague or a friend? Any other questions of Anthony about what to look for in your colleagues or yourself in terms of stress? And if anything they've said you would like them to elaborate on, I'm sure they'd be more than willing to. And Rhonda, thank you for starting this off. You can unmute yourself and take the floor or the bandwidth.
Thanks, Esther. Dave, it's a question for you. You made reference to your journey with PTSD. I wonder if you could tell us what that healing journey was like. How did you get from where you were to where you are?
Well, I'm still working on it because it changed me. I'm happy to talk about it anytime. So a decade ago, covering a really horrible, gruesome court case. It was the Russell Williams case, a lot of graphic material. And I was really keen to cover it. And I did so. I'm very proud of my coverage. But as I was doing it, I was also cutting a lot of corners. So it was in a smaller community, Belleville, Ontario. And in order to get a seat in the courtroom, you had to be there early because there were only so many seats. And because I was going to be live on the air on World Report at 5 a.m. anyway, I thought that getting there at 5 in the morning would be good. And so, so there was Christy Blatchford and there was Rosie DiMano and others who, we were all lined up at 5 in the morning for the doors were going to open at 8. So I'm doing live hits in the morning. Then we go in. And it is a nonstop horror show of images and testimony. And you're filing and you're tweeting. And I'm going out at lunch and I'm hitting at the satellite truck and doing live hits and I'm filing to the world at 6. And then in the evenings, I'm starting to think about, okay, so how am I going to tee up tomorrow morning's story? And so I would run up the road to the community of Tweed and I'd get advance interviews with some of the people that I knew were affected by the testimony that I knew was coming. anyway, the point is I was burning the candle at all ends. And by 10 o'clock at night, I would sit down with some colleagues at a bar and have a couple pints, because that was how I was going to deal with my stress. Anyway, long and the short of it is, after 5 days of intense coverage and not treating myself very well, not taking time to have lunch, to get rest, all of these things, in concert with the horrible material, I had this horrible stress response, and it flattened me for many weeks. And it took me a lot of talk therapy, some CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, to start to understand and get my anxiety under control. That was a decade ago. And I continue to do personal work on counseling. I still see a counselor from time to time. But my growth and my healing out of that has also involved looking at our industry. And because very few people in my workplace, even though I wrote about it and spoke about it, would talk about this. No one asked me how I was. No one built it into an understanding of the experience that I went through. So on future assignments, maybe I shouldn't, there was no discussion like that. And so part of my growth has been advocating and learning the science of science and stress and trying to bring that conversation into newsrooms. So that's why I'm here with you today, proposing this planning exercise, because we need to get better at having intentional conversations about, okay, well-being and stress, that's a thing. We've never prioritized it before. How are we going to do it now? We've got some advanced time before this horrible, mass casualty commission. How can we build conversations? And so that's why that's my journey of my own run-in with PTSD. It's how I got into trying to instruct and teach and understand this better. And it's not easy, because the culture of news is really about chasing and getting the story. And there is and I speak from a position of great privilege. Let me just say that. I'm 25 years in, I've got a secure CBC job. I'm white, I'm male, I'm not concerned about my next part-time gig. So in fact, I actually feel an obligation to use those privileges to force this conversation. So I'm keen to have it. That's a lot about me, but I really would invite, some of the things I've said here, you're probably rolling your eyes and saying, yeah, how's that going to happen? Let's talk about that, because maybe I've got some ideas on how you can try to make it happen.
And again, I was thinking exactly the same thing, Dave, that people are going to roll their eyes and say, oh yeah, sure. So I'm interested to know if any of you have had any of these conversations in your newsroom. And again, I know you feel vulnerable and it's hard to be anonymous here completely using the chat. I won't necessarily even say your name. Can you imagine approaching your managers? What do you think it would take to get this conversation started? I see that Pauline has her hand up. Do you want to unmute yourself, please, Pauline? Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Dave, thanks for this, and for how straightforward you are about talking about all of this stuff. And that really was what I wanted to ask you about, what Esther's talking about. I know several journalists I've worked with who have PTSD that has really crippled their lives in some serious ways. But we do in newsrooms sort of have a bit of a macho attitude about, we're powering through, and I think that, you said as recently as a year ago, there was somebody that you reported to who said that's not how this works. So what do you suggest, or Anthony, what do you suggest, or Esther as a former manager, what do you suggest for how we make that conversation happen, for ways that we can open the door effectively with people who are running newsrooms? And by the way, thanks, Rhonda, because you're obviously very enlightened.
And I'm going to let Dave and Anthony answer first. And I guess what I would also add, Anthony, is, are you seeing newsrooms that you would hold up that have best practices? And if you could share some of that in the consulting work you do.
Okay, yeah. So the answer to the last question is yes. There are news organizations now who run regular education sessions on the very topics that we're speaking about. So they don't wait for a crisis to start. They just have this ongoing discussion. It's not something that's, number one on the agenda, but it's running at a fairly consistent level that we're going to keep this topic alive. We're going to provide education sessions on a regular basis. They do it during lunchtime. So there is something called a lunchtime where people can come along and talk about it. Because I do think you change a culture through education. I think when I'm old enough to remember back when I did the very first study of war journalism, which goes back to 1 year after 9/11. The very first paper that my group published on journalists and PTSD turned out to be the very first publication in the trauma literature on journalists, which is an amazing thing because there was this huge literature on veterans and policemen and firefighters and victims of assault and rape, et cetera, but there was nothing written on journalists, not a single publication. Indeed, I didn't believe it at the time. I went to speak to the librarian at the Robarts Library at the U of T and said, what are we missing over here? Is there such a dearth in the trauma literature that there hasn't been anything written on journalists? And the answer was there hasn't, because what your profession had done, you had wrapped up yourselves in this kind of invulnerability. We're journalists, we don't get hurt. we're neutral observers. We are not part of the story. Somehow they had this idea that there was a buffer between them and the news. But that's a mistake. We know that's not true. And once we collected the empirical data, we could show that this indeed wasn't the case. And so news organizations took some of that on board and said, okay, how do we change? And change comes through education. You have to educate people that it's in your best interest to change. That when you change, in fact, it's a positive thing. You're not going to hurt your organization, just the opposite. You're going to make your organization stronger. You don't want journalists going off on prolonged sick leave. That's terrible for the journalist. It's terrible for their family, but it's also bad for the organization. You can't sustain that model. And so you need to convince people that this is very important. And the kind of analogy that I do to swing people around to try and understand how important it is to say, look, if you break a leg, you don't think twice about going along to the emergency room. You just do it. You go and you get your leg fixed and you leave. If you break psychologically, why should there be a difference? That's a false dichotomy. The mind-brain conundrum, the mind-body conundrum, it's all one. It's all there. It's all linked. You can't make a separation. But the other thing that happens to journalists is this. Many journalists have said to me, well, I'm reporting on people who've gone through terrible things. What right do I have to feel distressed? I'm dealing with people whose distress is so great that for me to suddenly say, look, I'm distressed, is a luxury, it's an indulgence. And I understand that, but that's what we call a cognitive distortion. That's a false belief system. And my answer to that is this. If the person with a broken leg goes along to the emergency room and the person in the bed lying next to him has 2 broken legs, you don't hop up on your one broken leg and hobble out and say, see the other man first. It's the same thing with psychological difficulties. There is no equivalence in terms of what you might be experiencing and others who've lost everyone in a mass shooting or suffered mass casualties. But that doesn't negate your own emotions. Your emotions are important to you, they're important to your family, and so get help for it. So I think these are the kind of battles that we need to fight, that you have to convince people through education that this topic is of prime importance, because I promise you, something like PTSD will bring you down much worse than a broken leg if you don't get it attended to.
If I may, I'm going to pick up on the broken leg. So you have a broken leg at work, your bosses and employers would probably look at that and go, oh yeah, okay, well, maybe you shouldn't be carrying the camera today because you're having trouble with your crutches. So if you are suffering a psychological injury or you're not well, you are, it's like the broken leg. It's like, well, you're just complaining. You're not up to it. Suck it up. I mean, that's how we that's the disconnect. We don't treat it as a real injury. And I actually 100% agree that education is the key to me. And that doesn't necessarily help you with planning for the Mass Casualty Commission. So I appreciate that that's a really tough answer in this context, but literacy around this is the thing that will change hearts and minds. And so even just having a little exercise, having a pre-meeting in your newsroom to begin conversations, that begins the literacy. But I think training, and it's, you don't have to tell the frontline journalists it's stressful. It's about connecting the dots and making sure that the entire newsroom and the leadership is enlightened, and you start to look at how you do the job and assign the job to make sure that you're factoring in well-being as a value, just like getting your facts right and making sure you get the good viz. Are you doing it in a safe and healthy way?
You know, a really interesting observation, I just want to pick up on that, was in 2013, the American Psychiatric Association tweeted their criteria for PTSD. And what they brought in is absolutely relevant to your profession. They said that exposure vicariously to trauma, if in your line of work, qualifies as a stress for PTSD. They were very clear in making a distinction. You know, if the average citizen watches the news at 9, that's not going to give a person PTSD. However, if in the nature of your work, you are relentlessly exposed to images of trauma, recollections of trauma, this vicarious exposure to trauma, that in itself, for some people, meets the threshold for a stressor for post-traumatic stress disorder. So, you know, as you enter these commissions of inquiry, when you have to relive traumatic events, and you are being exposed to them in multiple forms, you need to be aware that this kind of work can be very stressful. And that's now recognized by, you know, official bodies like the American Psychiatric Association.
And I would say that, you know, the work Anthony's done, the work David's done, the work, if I may say, that the Forum on Violence and Trauma has done, it's water on a stone. And one begins to see, I mean, Anthony, I think I first met you, Tony and I met you really early on, I think after your first publication, and it raised our awareness, and it certainly didn't permeate the culture overnight, still hasn't, I venture to guess, but I think there's been some progress. And, you know, in any way you can, I know you may feel vulnerable and not very powerful, you know, it becomes one more question at a planning or a story session, right? Like, what's the risk factor here? I think even if just starting there, even if you don't have a million solutions, it begins to change the thought process. I certainly know, you know, Dave, we probably didn't do enough for you after the Russell Williams inquiry. I shared all those images on the desk as well, but we did by then, I think, check in with people and make EAP available. Now, I think maybe the approach would be more sophisticated, one hopes, or ultimately. So, you know, I'm not saying it is now, but ultimately maybe it will be. You know, the important thing is to understand that while one would love to wave a wand and have this happen, it's not going to work that way. And the idea of education and conversation and more sessions like this involving more people, hopefully will shift to an extent the attention we pay to it. But Suzanne, you have your hand up. Please unmute yourself.
Hi. One thing I kind of wanted to talk about is the prevalence of casual work in journalism makes it very, very hard to stand up for yourself. Early in my career, I was a casual journalist for years, for about 3 years. And especially at the beginning, you know, it's all well and good to say, no, tell us if it's too much, but you always have that fear. If I say, no, I don't want to drive through the snowstorm, are they going to say, that's fine? And then the next day they'll call in the girl who will drive through the snowstorm. So what was so important to me early in my career was colleagues who were looking out for me, more senior colleagues who would say, hey, they're asking you too much. Normally people don't have that much on their plate. You're allowed to say no. Or even colleagues who would go directly to them and say, hey, I think that's too much to ask of Suzanne, and I think maybe we should split up the work. So that is something that is so vital, especially because Dave, I know that you work at CBC. That made all the difference for me. And you know, now I'm a little further along in my career and I feel comfortable speaking up for myself, saying, oh no, I don't feel safe doing that, or yes, this is okay, because those people stepped in for me.
Good point. It's like bullying, right? You can't be a bystander. Interesting point, Suzanne. Thank you. And reminding us how precarious work can be and how stressful that is also a very real part of this.
I think it's a real risk factor. And I think it's incumbent upon news organizations to understand that, because not only is it where's my next gig, but also a lot of casuals and temps get paid in lieu of benefits. So you don't have counseling. And I think that there's a moral, ethical problem that employers need to consider. I always say there's nothing casual about casual work. So I agree with you. And I think we should be challenging that.
Thanks. Graham, you have your hand up. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah. I mean, we've had a lot of traumatic things we've had to cover over the last 2 years, just with the shooting and the HMCS Fredericton crash, a missing boy in Truro, a snowbirds crash, all kind of happening within 1 month there in April 2020. And I've kind of been lucky enough not to be significantly impacted by that, but I've seen it happening to my colleagues and just other colleagues that have gone through it, specifically with the shooting. But I feel like more of my stressors would kind of be exterior conflicts, like, I don't know, financial stressors, family stressors. Just wondering how to, like, strategies for making sure those don't kind of make its way into your coverage and kind of, that they may potentially take over when you're working on covering an event like this.
I think that's a really great question, because we focus so intensely on our work, we tend to forget there's another large aspect to our life, which is our personal lives. And when things start becoming more complex in our personal lives, it can certainly compromise and make it difficult to run our professional lives. Everything is linked. And so the kind of attention that we pay to our work, the sensitivity that we show towards our colleagues, etc., we also need, of course, to do the same with family, with spouses, with children, etc. And so it's very important that we make time for our relationships, to nurture relationships. They are protective. I've said it before, they're protective to our mental health, and they're a buffer against stress in the workplace. And so when they start suffering, the knock-on effects can be considerable. I would say to you that if indeed there are interpersonal challenges unrelated to work, you need to obviously take them very seriously and devote the time and the energy and the resources to sort them out, because you don't want to avoid it. One of the worst kind of coping strategies is avoidance, where you just leave something. Nothing gets better when you avoid it. It tends to escalate and get worse over time. So you don't want to bring in avoidance with dealing with these kinds of difficulties.
I'd echo that, and I go back to my pickle jar, Graham. Like, we are only one vessel. We can only carry so much. And if your stress and your capacity is being taxed by things in your, at home or personal life or with relatives or relationships or whatever, that is taxing. Like, you can't pretend it's not. And the news business is great at not asking you about what's going on at home, because in some ways it's none of their business. But if you're carrying a lot and now going in to cover, really difficult things, you need to be aware of that for yourself, and maybe ask for some accommodation, at work, because you don't want to become overwhelmed. And so don't think that they're two different worlds. You are one person. You are a whole person. You're trying to be the person outside of work and be an excellent journalist. And if you've got stressors on either or both of those realms, they're in one pickle jar.
Graham, does that help? That answer?
Yeah, very much so. Thanks, guys.
Okay. I see Nicole's got her hand up. If you want to unmute yourself, please.
Hi, I was just thinking about how Dave said that he kind of gravitated towards things, whether they're tragic or whatnot. And I find that that's kind of something that I identify with. I've covered a lot of tragedy, especially in Nova Scotia recently. And I feel like that's just kind of something that I gravitate to, whether it's because it's during when I'm working, or it's just something that I'm interested in and I find myself in that situation. So I guess, how do I either put up barriers or protective barriers? Because it feels like I'm almost flying too close to the sun, where currently right now I don't feel like there's any effects from doing that, but I feel like eventually I may run into something and it may all come kind of coming down at once. So I guess, how do you kind of look out for yourself in that situation?
That's a
Anthony, do you have
great
time for a
question.
quick answer and then like give Dave a minute to
Yeah.
think about an answer? Because I know you
I,
have.
yeah, I do. It's a great question, and it's asked repeatedly. And I think the principles that Dave has spelled out and I've touched on are exactly the same. For me, respite as a form of resilience, it's a profound thing. It's very simple, hard to do, but you need your moments of respite. By all means, work hard. Do the intense stories. That's great. That's very important work. But have your moments of respite. Have a break from it. Otherwise, you tend to use up your emotional capacity. And that's a risk with something like this. You can get your moments of respite in many creative ways. I mean, you are a creative profession. So, turn the lens on yourself, turn the pen on yourself. What do you do? What do you like doing that's unrelated to work? And through planning and structure, you build it into your day-to-day activities. I have found that journalists can start off a day with lots of good intentions. They can say, we listened to those two wise men on this panel and this wise woman, and this is what we're going to do. But then the day takes over. It becomes so busy, you don't do it. You can start off the day with a very simple thing, a blank piece of paper and a pencil, and write out what's going to be your moment of respite during the day. Is it going to be to go for a walk for half an hour and focus on something else? Is it going to be some exercise during the day? Is it going to be taking a short break for a block of mindfulness meditation? But write it out and keep that blank piece of paper in front of you and stick to it. Start changing your work routine. Very difficult to do because you're shifting the habit of a lifetime. But if you have the strength to do it and things start shifting, that becomes your new norm. Your day then has this moment of respite, or every second day has this moment of respite. And that's how you start building up your resilience. And that gives you the strength for the long haul in dealing with these complex stories.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. Eat lunch. I'm not trying to be flip. I don't think I'm not a good judge because I'm still not, I still work like crazy. And I hear you. I think exactly as Anthony says, build balance into your regular practice, and you will benefit, and you will have that counterbalance so that when you're actually starting to get affected, I think.
Thank you. Pat, you have your hand up. Pat Healy, in case there's more than one. You want to unmute yourself, please?
Yes. Question is, what's your message to the journalists like us here in Nova Scotia who may know one or more of the victims from the mass casualty as we get ready to cover the inquiry? I know myself, I knew 3 of them, so it makes it extra tough and difficult. And I'm sure there's other journalists on here that might know some of the victims. So what's your message to us as we get ready to cover the inquiry?
That's a very difficult, that's a challenging issue because the distance that you typically have from the people who you report has now become much less. These are things that are very close to home. And what I've seen in my clinical practice over the years is that this introduces fresh challenges, new difficulties because of an emotional connection that you might typically not have with the victims of a tragedy. I think you really have to be particularly mindful of your emotional health at a time like this. All the things that we've enumerated now, you need to focus on. You need to make a concerted effort that despite the proximity, the emotional proximity of the story, you do need to have attention on yourself. Don't feel guilty in doing it. Don't feel somehow that you're kind of compromising your own ability to work because you step back a little bit in your moment of respite. Just the opposite. That's going to help you. That's going to get you through what might be a more difficult experience than you anticipate. So, building in time for yourself in the midst of a difficult story like this becomes particularly important. And remember that, although you're there as a journalist and you know some of the people and your humanity reaches out to comfort people, don't take on the role of a social worker. Don't take on the role of a healer at a time like this because, number one, you're not trained to do it. Yes, you have to be empathic, but you have to be careful of the margins becoming blurred because I've seen that. And through good intentions, you end up, making things more complicated for yourself and other people. We know that, the road to damnation is paved with good intentions. So be able to maintain a little bit of distance while still maintaining your empathy. And that can be very hard to do. So it's good that you're aware of these issues before you step into the complexities of a story like this.
And I would guess that in a situation like this, never mind comforting others, reaching out to those who can comfort you and making yourself vulnerable enough to reach out to friends and family when it does start feeling personal is probably helpful too. You deserve the comfort, right? Dave?
I'm saying this from the privilege of being in Toronto, where the stories I do are usually big and at a far remove, right? So I don't cover stories about people that are close or that I know, and I have that luxury and privilege. And so I'll be honest. What I'm thinking is, I don't know if you should do that. Like, do you have a choice? Ask yourself that. Do you need to cover that if you are that close? Because I think it's a risk factor. I think it crosses, it's not just journalism now, it's very much in your personal emotional landscape, and it can be deeply affecting. So number one, do you have a choice? And if you feel you don't and you want to cover it, you need to take extra care. Yeah, and what does that mean? Well, maybe you don't cover it every day, or if you do cover it every day, like, be very, very intentional about finding those ways that you're going to every day. Okay, to keep my head straight, I'm going to eat my lunch and I'm going to take half an hour wherever it is, or after the day of filing, I'm going to, intentionally connect with this group of people or fellow journalists just to decompress. I don't have a full answer for you, but to be honest, for those of you who are covering this, when you've got personal connections, I would ask yourself, is that really a good idea?
Dave, in fact, Pat answered you in the chat saying it's exactly what he's been thinking, avoiding covering it. So I think
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Dave has just validated what your own good sense was telling you, Pat. So if it is possible, maybe that would be the way to go. Pat, did you want to add? Yeah. Did you want to add anything, Pat?
No, just wanted to say thank you.
Okay, great.
So can I want to drill down on this a tiny bit. Pat, I feel for you because I know that you work independently a lot. Do you have an option to not cover it?
I can probably not cover it, and because there's enough people in my local area probably watching and reading the other media coverage of it, my stories wouldn't be any different. So that's my saving grace in this, I think, is the other media coverage.
If you've got a way to, for your audience to sort of signal to them that that's a decision, like, I'd look out for yourself in this, especially as you describe your relation to three, or knowing three people. I'll tell you, as somebody who's been deeply affected by PTSD, I wouldn't choose it. I wouldn't, it's, if you can avoid it, be smart about it. Don't do it.
Sounds like he's.
Thank you. Thank you.
Is leaning that way. Good for you.
Yeah.
Good model. So I'm going to go to Reed because Graham, I know we've already spoken once, but I will get back to you. So Reed, can you unmute yourself, please? There you are. Hi.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to build on what Pat was saying. I mean, a lot of us have, been with this story, in bed with this story, if you want to go to that extreme, since March of 2020. I remember a Friday afternoon after the weekend of that horrible series of events where we had a false alarm in the newsroom about some shots being fired in a suburb of Halifax, and people in tears. And that's something that stayed with me for most of this time since then. but you know, a lot of us who are covering this day to day, grinding it out, as you say, Dave, there has to be a bit of cynicism, has to be a bit of foreshadowing when we're hearing reports that, you know, we don't even know what sort of cross-examination will be allowed in this inquiry, and you know, satirical press, aka Frank Magazine, reporting all kinds of background information, background stuff that, you know, may not even see the light of day. How do we avoid re-experiencing that trauma in one form or another when we know, as journalists covering it day to day, doing the nuts and bolts, that, you know, we may be heading down a road that's predetermined or somewhat predetermined, or that the real truth will not come out?
Well, I don't know. That's a tricky question.
And I don't mean to be tricky. I'm just, this is something that I'm dealing with.
I would encourage you to dig. You know, if part of this is getting at truth and the process itself, the Commission of Inquiry has problems, report on that. You know, if the healing that's going to come out of this, the positive for the millions upon millions of dollars that are going to get spent reviewing this horrible event, for those to be worthwhile, it's got to be a good, strong process. And so the story doesn't have to be entirely framed by what the inquiry sets out as the testimony in the official story. Because if there's stuff going on there, I would say, yeah, sure, I would report on that to make sure that the public we're serving, you know, is confident in the process. And if there are reasons not to be, then I think it's worth reporting on. I don't know if that helps. I mean, that's a big ask, but I think there's something to be said about embracing the good that can be done through reporting these stories to help get you through the grind and the ugliness. You know, investing in this as a public good. And I'm not saying trick yourself, but because the other alternative is, if you don't think that you're making public good, and if you're really just burning out, then I would say try to get off it. But if there's enough there that you think, no, actually telling these stories is going to be good, it's going to be good for the public to hear this, and maybe it's good to cast light on the questions around the inquiry itself, great. I don't know if that helps, Reed. I hear your conundrum.
Reed, did you want to respond?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not expecting, I wasn't expecting an answer. I just wanted to share that, those thoughts. You know, when it's predetermined, and for someone who's been around for, you know, not that I'm a grizzled veteran yet, but you know, 20 years plus, you know, it's you get to know the process, and that's my real concern, that, you know, that the truth won't come out. And as a journalist, that's, you know, that's an issue for me. So I just want to share that, and I don't want to necessarily have to, you know, feel as though we haven't done our job based on the conditions that have been set up under which this inquiry is going to take place. So I'm not looking, as I say, I'm not looking for answers, but you know, I think it's, for me, it's an issue as someone on the assignment desk. And by the way, I appreciate all the love for the assignment desk on this call. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
Lots of responsibility on your shoulders, Reed, and I've no doubt you'll execute excellently. Okay, no more in the chat. Graham, do you want to unmute yourself?
Just wanted to mention, Dave mentioned on the lunch front, we did a site tour there today of the Halifax Convention Center, and lunch will be provided for at least the start. So that was just great news.
You know what? That is great news. someone is thinking about well-being, like honestly. So you may not have a luxurious 1 hour for lunch, but you'll be able to slam some food down. And
Yeah, at least you'd be able to eat.
well, actually, so now use that as an invitation. If the food's supplied, make sure you go for a stroll, right? Get away from your laptop for a few minutes. And well, okay, so Reed's put in, yeah, free lunch. Yeah, well, fair enough. That gets into all sorts of ethical territory as to whether you should take it. Oh, I think you're muted, Esther.
I was going to say, yeah, great, the lunch is provided, but that can have the effect of not making you move. So Dave's right. Eat it and then take the time that you would have had to stand in line at Subway to go for a walk. Rhonda.
I will definitely take into account.
Okay, Graham, thanks.
I do have to credit the Mass Casualty Commission as communicators have been really difficult to deal with. They're not very forthcoming. It's hard to get answers. It's hard to get through that wall that they've set up around the process and what they do. But to give them credit, mental health and the impact of what they're about to embark on has been top line. Part of the impetus for this conversation was them reaching out and having a conversation and saying, what about the mental health of journalists?
Oh.
And, I shared with them the session we did May of 2020 on vicarious trauma, and they were really intrigued and wanted to find out more. And I said, this is probably a really good opportunity for us to do it again, which is why I reached out to the forum to try to organize this. They allowed me in a media briefing last week to address the journalists they had gathered, just to say, listen, we're going to do this. Here's how you can sign up. Here's how you participate. So, and I know, although I told them they could join, they haven't, but they have asked for a recording so they can get some information, I think. So, for kind of the challenge they present to us as journalists to try some information, they have at least acknowledged that this is going to have an impact on not just on the families and the people that they're talking about, but the journalists who are covering the stories, and Nova Scotians, actually, because that's the other piece that we challenges us, is that we're not just journalists, we're residents of the community. We're residents who never really had, as a community, as a province, ever had the opportunity to grieve properly because of COVID and because of the restrictions that were in place at times. So as broadcasters, I know we'll be sharing on a regular basis numbers and resources for citizens to reach out to, because I think as time has passed, we've all kind of put it off to the side or behind us. It's not top of mind every day, but this is going to bring it right back to where we were almost 2 years ago. So that's my piece.
If I could, I've got two little thoughts that come off of that. I mean, police officers, Crown attorneys, the legal profession, and jurors are people who, like journalists, bear witness, right? And there's a lot of thinking about the vicarious trauma in those jobs. And so this science and this understanding is evolving, and journalists, we need to realize we are frontline, and we sit and we watch and consume and digest other people's trauma, and it sticks with us. So I'm not surprised, and I'm pleased to hear that they are embracing that conversation. And then the other thought that I wanted to share is, in trying to understand vicarious trauma, because we always like to think of ourselves as at a remove from the stories, and Anthony was raising this sort of false logic where we say, oh, well, because they suffered more, we can't also suffer. There's some interesting stuff in the science around how our brains work. We can rationalize all of that, right? We can rationalize that, oh, we're doing a job here and those people are over there and they went through that and this isn't us. But somebody made this example. We can also watch horror movies, right? We can sit on the couch and we can watch a gory horror movie, And we understand that it's Hollywood and it's all fake, but there's our internal fear center, our amygdala is what it's called, is firing, and we still get scared and our heart rate goes up and we start to stress when we're watching a horror movie, even though we know it's entirely fake. So that just tells you how our brain works, that our rational brain, we can reason all of this stuff away, but the reality is we're taking in images, we're taking in people's emotions, and that fear center in our brain is driving the stress response. And anyway, for what it's worth, it's a bit of a sidebar, but that sort of resonated with me. It's like, yeah, we're not fully in control of our responses as much as we want to rationalize, oh, I'm bigger than this. No, we're actually very susceptible. It's kind of like watching a horror movie.
For real. So thanks, Dave. Callum, you have your hand up. Could you unmute, please?
Whoops, there we go. Hi there. Thanks, guys, for organizing this. I very much appreciate it. Very helpful and informative. I guess my question is, what should we be on the lookout for amongst colleagues and peers? Obviously, I think coming together as a team is going to be pretty important through something, especially as significant as this inquiry. But I guess aside from just the how are you doing? Are you okay? What, if anything, should we be watching for? And I guess any summarizing points on how to help?
Well, so I'm not a therapist and I'm not an expert. So I'll say that off the top. I recently took a mental health first aid course, and this is what it taught me. Changes in behavior. Somebody's acting a little differently, and that can be a whole bunch of things. That can be someone is really angry. That could be someone's really quiet. Changes in the behavior of the person that you usually know to be this way, but they're really kind of not. That's one thing. What to do? Yeah, I mean, the question, how are you, is a bit probing, and people we're journalists, we're wise to it. Oh, I see what you're doing there. You're asking me how I am. I would just encourage people to build into their work week and into their work patterns time to shoot the shit, as it were, because it's in the relationships and it's in those moments where you can just have a knowing look and you can have a, letting the steam out of a bad day. So the more you can build that in intentionally, so you don't have to ask each other how you're doing, but you know what, you've made a point that, every Friday or after work, you're going to have discussions. It just helps. It helps provide a space for people to exhale if you need it. But the other thing is, look, I think we need to acknowledge that none of us are experts in this, and don't feel badly about that. But if you've got a gut instinct that maybe your colleague isn't doing great, suggest to them, maybe you should get some help. Try to know what the resources are available either through your work or in the community, and suggest to them that, are you okay? Like, do you need have this information? That isn't a comfortable spot for colleagues. But I think under these working conditions and this particular subject matter, I think we need to be prepared just to take that step, and the person may not need it, but they may. And if they do, and you happen to provide them with the right phone number at the right time or the right encouragement at the right time, you can make a world of difference. And that's the best you can try to do, because we're not experts.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate that.
Thank you. It's a great question. I mean, what are we to do? None of us signed up for this job thinking that we were maybe one day going to have to provide mental health first aid, and I go back to a comment, Reed, you made, about all the love for the assignment desk. If I'm coming off a little anti-assignment, or if I'm raising the responsibility, that I actually have a great deal of empathy for people in supervisory roles, because people on the assignment desk also didn't anticipate having to check in on their people. People in assignment and supervisory roles are not experts. Generally speaking, people in management and supervisory roles have come from journalism, and they're in those roles because they're excellent at stories and the editorial. Didn't think it was going to become part of their remit to have to monitor people's mental health. So I've got a lot of time and concern about the pressures, because you're under pressure to make good product and get your people to do it, and without people in the field getting the stuff done, there's gaping holes in the television newscast or gaping holes in the, on the online digital offer. So this is a real puzzle for the entire industry at different levels, and I think assignment and supervisors need support too. And so a wise person at CBC who has helped me develop my internal course at CBC reduces it to this one word: literacy. And so we can fidget with our protocols on this, that, or the next thing, but ultimately, long-term in our industry, the way we're going to tackle this and get better at it is that we all become a little more literate around what stress, what PTSD, what risk factors look like on the job. We may not solve that problem by next week, by the time the commission starts, but that is the benefit of having these kinds of conversations.
And I think the literacy, I hope, contributes to a destigmatizing and acknowledging that this is real. So we're almost at the end of our time. I don't see any more hands. I am going to say what Jane Hawks just put in the chat, and that is, first of all, I'm going to say thank you very much for making this happen, Rhonda, to Dave for providing us with such great information, and Anthony, who had to leave us. They've been really useful. And if you are looking for more resources, please do check out, and Jane has put the website up, the Canadian Journalism Forum on Violence and Trauma. We provide training for both physical safety. There are bursaries for freelancers. We've published a guide to reporting mental health called Mindset, which has been quite widely used. And there's a ton of resource and links to lots of other places like the DART Center, which does this work as well as many other articles and so on. So www.journalismforum.ca. Very worthwhile, I think, to check it out. And please let us know if there are other things we can do for you or materials you're looking for. And perhaps we would be able to, yes, and Ron just put the DART Center link in as well, which is basically dartcenter.org. And those are really worthwhile resources. And I'm going to sort of count to 6 slowly and see if there's any more questions. And a couple of other comments here, good reminders. The younger journalists, take note of the shared wisdom and don't hesitate to talk with your HR, EAP, and bosses. Hey, even the assignment editors can have a heart too. True enough. Rhonda, you're assignment, right? No.
I'm occasionally assigned. No, Reed is the assignment editor in our office. No, I'm the news director. So, but I try to let our people know that my door's open, and if they have concerns about someone else's mental health, even coming to me and letting me approach that person and making sure that they've got the resources that they need is another way. I think that if you've got concerns or noticing something, it might be a way to go.
Yeah, you're certainly leading the way here, Rhonda. Thank you for another way of making sure everyone is safe. So on that note, Dave, I don't know if you have anything more you want to say. Thank you,
just best wishes.
Yes, I'm going to say everybody stay safe, both physically and mentally. And, cliched as it is, be good to each other, watch out for each other. It does make a difference. And let people know we've done this and that the recording is available if you think it'll be useful for them. And again, if you want to reach out, you can reach out through the forum. We can put you in touch with other resources, and all the best.
Okay, thanks so much,
Thank you
Dave
all.
and Esther. Thanks so much. And thanks everyone for joining.
Take care. Yes, thank you for your
Okay.
time.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Bye. Thanks, Tim.